The bedroom, upon closer examination, revealed itself to be a landscape of deliberate arrangement and meticulous preservation. Yet it was precisely this quality of obsessive orderliness that rendered certain irregularities immediately apparent to an observer possessed of Whimsy's particular predilections toward noticing what ought not to be present or what ought to have been present, but was conspicuously absent. The bedside table, for instance, bore the marks of having been recently cleaned, not the ordinary domestic cleanliness that characterized the remainder of the chamber, but rather a more thorough and concentrated effort at sanitation, as though someone had intended to eliminate evidence of a particular substance or activity that had occurred in close proximity to Mrs. Hartington's sleeping form. The carpet beside the bed displayed a faint dampness that seemed inconsistent with the otherwise arid condition of the chamber, and there was a peculiar odor in the air, subtle, easily overlooked by persons not actively searching for it, but nonetheless present to anyone possessed of an adequately developed olfactory sensitivity and the theoretical knowledge to interpret what his senses were communicating. Whimsy proceeded to examine the window fastenings with particular attention, noting that whilst they were indeed locked, the mechanisms appeared to have been recently manipulated, suggesting that someone had tested their security within a relatively recent time frame, even though the window itself remained closed and gave no evidence of having been opened. He consulted his pocket notebook and sketched the spatial arrangement of the chamber's furnishings, measuring distances with the precision of a man constructing an architectural plan, and noting the position of the bonnet upon the dressing table with reference to the bed's location and the trajectory of sight lines from various points within the room. It was only after completing this preliminary examination that Whimsy descended to the drawing-room, where the household staff had been assembled under Parker's somewhat uncomfortable supervision. Uncomfortable because Parker possessed the characteristic law enforcement officer's distrust of amateur investigators, particularly amateur investigators who happened to possess titles and the sort of casual authority that accompanied aristocratic birth. The staff consisted of 6 individuals, a butler named Craddock, whose demeanor suggested the military bearing of a man who had progressed through ranks and preferred the discipline of a well-ordered establishment, a housekeeper designated Mrs. Pemberton, who possessed that particular quality of austere respectability that characterized women of her station who had devoted their lives to maintaining the boundaries between propriety and chaos, a cook named Mrs. Fielding, whose ample proportions and flour-dusted apron suggested a woman whose relationship with food extended beyond mere professional obligation, 2 housemaids, Mary and Catherine, who bore the nervous pallor of servants conscious that they might be implicated in circumstances beyond their comprehension or control, and finally, a lady's maid named Dorothy, whose features displayed an expression of genuine distress that seemed to transcend the professional mourning that circumstances demanded. Whimsy greeted this assembly with his customary courtesy, observing that he had come at the request of the constabulary to examine certain aspects of Mrs. Hartington's death that appeared to merit further investigation, and that he would require absolute candor from all parties regarding their observations and activities during the evening and night hours preceding the discovery of their employer's demise. He began his inquiry by requesting that each member of the household provide a precise account of their movements following Mrs. Hartington's retirement to her bedchamber at 9 o'clock, inquiring specifically regarding who had observed her at that time, who had access to her chamber during the hours of darkness, and whether anyone had heard any sounds or disturbances that might suggest unusual activity. Craddock testified that he had locked the front and rear doors at the customary hour, that he had observed nothing unusual during his evening rounds, and that he had personally conveyed Mrs. Hartington's evening tisane to her chamber at 8:30, finding her in good spirits and in apparent good health. Mrs. Pemberton corroborated this testimony and added that she had supervised the household's preparation for the evening and had noted nothing amiss in Mrs. Hartington's demeanor or health. Yet it was Dorothy, the lady's maid, who betrayed the first signs of genuine distress when questioned, her fingers twisting nervously within the fabric of her apron and her eyes avoiding direct contact with Whimsy's gaze. When pressed regarding whether she had observed anything unusual, she admitted, with evident reluctance, that Mrs. Hartington had seemed unusually agitated during the dressing hour, that she had inquired repeatedly regarding the weather forecast and the condition of the streets outside, and that she had requested that Dorothy remain in close proximity to her chamber throughout the evening, a request which was entirely contrary to Mrs. Hartington's customary practice of maintaining strict privacy, once she had retired for the night. This revelation produced an immediate intensification in Whimsy's interest, and he pressed Dorothy regarding the precise nature of Mrs. Hartington's agitation, whether she had made any specific statements regarding expected visitors or communications, and whether she had displayed fear or merely nervous anticipation. Dorothy admitted, under this gentle but relentless questioning, that Mrs. Hartington had seemed to be awaiting something, though she could not specify what, and that she had instructed Dorothy to remain awake and alert should anyone attempt to enter her chamber during the night hours. When Whimsy inquired whether anyone had indeed attempted such entry, Dorothy hesitated considerably before admitting that she had, in fact, heard movement in the corridor outside Mrs. Hartington's chamber sometime around midnight, and that she had emerged from her adjoining room to investigate. She had observed a figure. She could not determine the identity of this person in the darkness, departing from Mrs. Hartington's chamber and proceeding toward the staircase with apparent haste. She had initially assumed that the figure was Craddock, or one of the other male servants attending to some household matter, and she had therefore not pursued the matter further, though she admitted that in retrospect this assumption seemed scarcely credible given the hour and the absence of any logical explanation for such nocturnal activity. Whimsy absorbed this intelligence with an expression of profound interest, and he asked Dorothy whether she had reported this observation to anyone, whether she had subsequently verified that Mrs. Hartington was unharmed, and whether she had observed any changes in Mrs. Hartington's demeanor or appearance during the morning hours that might suggest that something traumatic had occurred during the night. Dorothy's responses to these queries were characterized by an increasing degree of emotional distress, and she admitted that she had indeed attempted to verify Mrs. Hartington's well-being following the mysterious nocturnal visitor's departure, but that she had found her employer's chamber door locked from the interior and had received no response to her tentative knocking. She had assumed, she explained with evident self-recrimination, that Mrs. Hartington had already fallen asleep or had preferred not to be disturbed, and she had therefore retired to her own chamber without further investigation. This admission seemed to strike Dorothy with considerable force, as though she was suddenly recognizing that her failure to pursue the matter with greater persistence might have constituted a dereliction of duty that had resulted in consequences of irreversible significance. Whimsy observed this reaction with sympathy and noted that Dorothy appeared to be a woman of genuine conscience who was tormented by the possibility that her passivity might have contributed to Mrs. Hartington's death, a possibility which Whimsy neither confirmed nor denied, but which he filed away for later consideration alongside the other accumulating details that seemed to suggest patterns incompatible with the simple explanation of natural death that the local constabulary seemed so eager to accept. He proceeded to interrogate the remainder of the household staff with meticulous attention to temporal detail, inquiring regarding the exact times at which various tasks had been completed, the precise duration of absences from designated areas, and the specific observations that each individual had made regarding sounds, disturbances, or unusual activities during the night hours. The responses that emerged from this systematic questioning were notable primarily for their conformity to an apparent conspi. Racy of ignorance, everyone agreed that they had observed nothing unusual, heard nothing disturbing, and had no knowledge whatsoever of any unauthorized visitor to the household. Yet the very uniformity of these denials seemed to Whimsy to constitute evidence in itself, as it suggested a coordinated effort at deception, or at the very minimum a collective decision to withhold information that might prove embarrassing or incriminating to one or more members of the household. He dismissed the assembled servants with thanks for their cooperation, though his expression suggested that he regarded their cooperation as consisting primarily of the provision of carefully edited versions of the truth rather than the whole and unvarnished account that actual cooperation would have entailed. Once they had departed, he turned to Parker and expressed the opinion that the death of Mrs. Hartington was almost certainly not the result of natural causes, and that the mysterious nocturnal visitor, combined with the presence of the damp bonnet and the apparent chemical contamination of Mrs. Hartington's bedside table, suggested a scheme of considerable sophistication and deliberate intent. Parker, manifesting the skepticism that had characterized his response to Whimsy's more speculative flights of deductive fancy in years past, inquired what possible motive anyone might possess for the murder of an 83-year-old widow whose principal remaining capacity appeared to be the retention of substantial financial assets for eventual distribution to her heirs. Whimsy responded by observing that Parker was presumably already acquainted with the provisions of Mrs. Hartington's will, and that if Parker were to provide him with the details of the intended beneficiaries and the magnitude of the bequests involved, they might begin to construct a framework within which certain motivations could be examined and evaluated. Parker admitted somewhat reluctantly that he had indeed obtained a copy of Mrs. Hartington's will from her solicitors, and that the document revealed a distribution of considerable complexity. The bulk of the estate, valued at approximately £400,000, was to be divided equally among Mrs. Hartington's 3 surviving children, all of whom had reached adulthood, and who presumably possessed sufficient financial security that the prospect of inheritance was unlikely to constitute an irresistible motivation for the commission of murder. However, the will also contained a curious codicil that had been added within the past 6 months, specifically providing that should Mrs. Hartington die under circumstances that appeared inconsistent with natural causes, the entire estate would be conveyed to the National Trust for the establishment of a charitable institution dedicated to the care of elderly women of limited means, thereby depriving the designated heirs of their anticipated inheritance. This revelation produced an expression of profound interest in Whimsy's features, and he observed that such a provision seemed singularly designed to ensure that nobody possessed of financial motive would have reason to wish Mrs. Hartington dead. Indeed, the provision accomplished precisely the opposite effect, rendering her continued survival the most lucrative possibility from the perspective of her biological heirs. This paradox suggested to Whimsy that the death of Mrs. Hartington might have been motivated not by desire for financial gain, but rather by something considerably more complex and considerably more psychologically compelling: the desire for revenge, the compulsion to eliminate a perceived threat, or the need to prevent Mrs. Hartington from revealing some information that she possessed regarding events or circumstances that might prove damaging to the perpetrator's interests or reputation. He requested that Parker provide him with the names and biographical details of Mrs. Hartington's children, her surviving siblings if any existed, and any individuals who had maintained regular contact with her during her final years. Parker provided this information with the air of a man performing a duty whose relevance he did not fully appreciate, but whose completion seemed necessary to indulge Whimsy's inevitable descent into abstract speculation. The details that emerged indicated that Mrs. Hartington's 3 surviving children were Robert, aged 58, and a retired diplomat of considerable standing, Margaret, aged 55, and the widow of a prominent merchant, and Edward, aged 51, and a physician of some distinction. Additionally, Mrs. Hartington maintained contact with a great-niece named Victoria Ashford, aged 24, whose parents had died in an accident some years prior, and who had been the recipient of Mrs. Hartington's particular affection and considerable financial support throughout her adolescence and young adulthood. The mention of Victoria Ashford produced an immediate response in Whimsy's demeanor, and he inquired with considerable interest regarding the nature of Victoria's relationship with her great-aunt, the frequency of her visits to the Belgrave Square residence, and whether she had been present in the household on the evening preceding Mrs. Hartington's death. Parker consulted his preliminary investigation notes and indicated that Victoria Ashford had indeed called upon Mrs. Hartington on the afternoon of the day in question, that she had remained in the house for approximately 2 hours, and that she had apparently departed in the company of a gentleman whom none of the household staff had been able to identify with certainty. Furthermore, Parker added, Victoria had sent a telegram to the Hartington residence early on the morning of the discovery, inquiring regarding her great-aunt's health and indicating that she would call in the afternoon, a telegram which had arrived several hours after the discovery of Mrs. Hartington's death, and which therefore could scarcely have been motivated by prior knowledge of the fatal outcome. Yet Wimsey noted that the timing of Victoria's telegram suggested that she had been expecting some particular development or event that morning, and he requested that Parker arrange an interview with Victoria Ashford at the earliest opportunity, observing that a young woman of 24 who maintained close contact with an elderly great-aunt and who had visited the house on the very day preceding the death seemed worthy of detailed examination. The interview with Victoria Ashford was arranged for the following afternoon at Parker's office, and when she appeared, Wimsey found himself confronted with a young woman whose appearance suggested considerable refinement and whose demeanor indicated intelligence tempered by genuine distress at the death of a relative whom she apparently had regarded with considerable affection. Victoria was dark-haired and possessed features that suggested good breeding rather than conventional beauty, and she bore herself with the sort of quiet dignity that characterized women who had been raised to value propriety whilst simultaneously maintaining sufficient independence of thought to question whether propriety constituted the highest good. She received Wimsey's introduction with polite formality, and she seemed to recognize immediately that this meeting constituted something considerably more serious than the routine inquiries that Parker had conducted during his preliminary investigation. Wimsey began his interrogation by expressing sympathy regarding her loss and by observing he understood she had been among the last persons to see Mrs. Hartington alive, a circumstance which he suggested might prove valuable in establishing the precise state of her great-aunt's health and mental condition during her final hours. Victoria acknowledged this observation and proceeded to provide an account of her visit to Belgrave Square on the afternoon preceding Mrs. Hartington's death, explaining that she had called to discuss a personal matter of some delicacy with her great-aunt, and that she had found Mrs. Hartington in good spirits and apparently in excellent health. When pressed regarding the specific nature of the personal matter that had motivated her visit, Victoria hesitated considerably before admitting that she had come to inform Mrs. Hartington of her intention to become engaged to a gentleman of whom her great-aunt was apparently aware, but regarding whom she harbored certain reservations. The gentleman in question was a Mr. James Aldington, a man of approximately 32 years whose financial circumstances were comfortable but not substantial, and whose family background was respectable but not distinguished. Victoria explained that Mrs. Hartington had expressed disapproval of the proposed engagement, primarily on the grounds that she believed Victoria deserved a husband whose social and financial position would be commensurate with her own elevated status and the considerable inheritance that she would eventually receive. The conversation between great-aunt and great-niece had apparently become somewhat heated, with Mrs. Hartington declaring that she would not consent to the engagement and threatening that should Victoria proceed with the match against her wishes, she would revise her will to exclude Victoria from her inheritance. Victoria admitted that this threat had caused her considerable distress and that she had departed the house in tears, though she insisted that she had by no means agreed to abandon her intention to marry Mr. Aldington despite her great-aunt's disapproval. Wimsey inquired regarding the identity of the gentleman who had accompanied Victoria from the house, and Victoria admitted that this had indeed been Mr. Aldington himself, who had waited in the street whilst she conducted her conversation with Mrs. Hartington, and who had comforted her following the distressing interview. When Wimsey asked whether Mr. Aldington had been aware of the threats that Mrs. Hartington had made, Victoria responded affirmatively, and she admitted that Mr. Aldington had seemed considerably agitated by this intelligence, expressing the opinion that Mrs. Hartington's behavior was unreasonable, and suggesting that Victoria's great-aunt appeared to be growing eccentric in her advanced years. Wimsey then inquired whether Victoria possessed any knowledge regarding the mysterious bonnet that had been discovered in Mrs. Hartington's bedchamber, and whether she had observed Mrs. Hartington in possession of any unusual objects or garments during the course of her visit. Victoria responded negatively to both questions, professing complete ignorance regarding the bonnet's origin and purpose. Yet when Wimsey inquired whether Mr. Aldington had ever been in possession of any chemical substances or compounds of a pharmaceutical nature, or whether he had displayed any particular interest in toxicology or related scientific disciplines, Victoria's response suggested that this question had struck her with considerable force, and she admitted, with obvious reluctance, that Mr. Aldington had once been employed as a pharmaceutical assistant before entering his current profession as a merchant, and that he had retained considerable knowledge regarding the properties and applications of various chemical compounds. Whimsy A.B. sorbed this intelligence with an expression of profound interest, and he proceeded to inquire regarding the precise dates upon which Mr. Aldington had been employed as a pharmaceutical assistant, the specific nature of his responsibilities during this period, and whether Victoria had any knowledge of the compounds with which he had worked, or the degree of expertise that he had acquired. Victoria admitted that she possessed limited knowledge regarding these matters, as Mr. Aldington rarely discussed his previous employment, and she had gained the impression that he had found the work unsatisfying and had deliberately abandoned the pharmaceutical field in favor of what he regarded as a more lucrative and socially prestigious occupation. Whimsy then requested that Victoria provide him with Mr. Aldington's current address, and suggested that he would require an interview with the gentleman at his earliest convenience, as certain details regarding his movements on the evening preceding Mrs. Hartington's death required clarification. Victoria hesitated at this request, and she expressed evident anxiety regarding what such an inquiry might suggest regarding Mr. Aldington's potential involvement in her great-aunt's death. Whimsy responded with careful reassurance, explaining that routine inquiries into the activities of all individuals who had maintained recent contact with the deceased was standard investigative procedure, and that the fact that Mr. Aldington was being questioned should not be interpreted as evidence of suspicion. Yet his tone, despite this reassurance, suggested that he harbored considerably more than routine suspicion regarding Mr. Aldington's role in events. Upon concluding the interview with Victoria, Whimsy consulted with Parker regarding the logistics of locating Mr. James Aldington and arranging a meeting at a time and location that would maximize the probability of obtaining accurate testimony. Parker indicated that he had already obtained Aldington's address during the preliminary investigation and that he could arrange for the man to be brought to his office under the pretext of a routine follow-up inquiry. However, Whimsy suggested that a more informal approach might prove advantageous, and he expressed a preference for conducting the interview at Aldington's residence, as the man's domestic environment frequently proved revelatory regarding aspects of his character and activities that he might otherwise consciously conceal. Accordingly, that evening, Whimsy and Parker proceeded to the modest townhouse in Kensington where Aldington maintained his residence, and they found him at home and apparently engaged in the perusal of a scientific journal whose subject matter appeared to be the properties and applications of various botanical alkaloids. Aldington's initial reaction to Whimsy's presence suggested a man suddenly confronted with a danger whose precise dimensions he could not immediately determine, and his efforts at maintaining composure seemed to require considerable conscious effort. Whimsy opened the conversation by complimenting Aldington upon his apparent interest in botanical science and inquiring regarding the specific focus of his research and whether his pharmaceutical background had motivated this continuing engagement with subjects that lay beyond the scope of his current commercial occupation. Aldington's responses were characterized by evasiveness and defensive hostility, and he suggested that his reading habits constituted a matter of purely private concern and that his reasons for engaging in particular intellectual pursuits required no justification to strangers who appeared in his home without prior warning. Whimsy responded to this assertion with perfect courtesy, observing that he recognized the validity of Aldington's position, but that certain circumstances surrounding the death of Mrs. Millicent Hartington had suggested the necessity of inquiring into the activities and knowledge of individuals who had maintained recent contact with the deceased and who possessed particular expertise in areas that seemed tangentially related to the circumstances of her death. At the mention of Mrs. Hartington's name, Aldington's face underwent a visible transformation, and he admitted, with evident reluctance, that he had indeed known of Mrs. Hartington through his engagement to Victoria Ashford, and that he had been aware of the elderly widow's disapproval of his proposed marriage to her great-niece. When Whimsy inquired whether Aldington had been aware of Mrs. Hartington's threats to revise her will and thereby exclude Victoria from the inheritance, Aldington responded affirmatively and expressed the opinion that such threats constituted unconscionable emotional manipulation, designed to coerce Victoria into abandoning her own desires in favor of conforming to her great-aunt's preferences and expectations. Whimsy then inquired regarding Aldington's activities during the evening and night hours preceding Mrs. Hartington's death, inquiring specifically whether he had called upon the Hartington residence at any time during that period, whether he had engaged in any activities involving the preparation or administration of chemical substances, and whether he possessed any knowledge regarding the origins or purpose of the mysterious bonnet that had been discovered in Mrs. Hartington's bedchamber. Aldington's responses to these inquiries were characterized by increasing agitation, and he insisted with rising vehemence that he had done nothing whatsoever to harm Mrs. Hartington, that he had not called upon the Hartington residence on the night in question, and that the Whodunit in question was entirely unknown to him. Yet, when Whimsy pressed him regarding the specific details of his movements and asked him to account for his whereabouts during the hours between 9 in the evening and 7 in the morning, Aldington's testimony became increasingly vague and contradictory, suggesting that he was either engaged in deliberate deception or that he was attempting to conceal some activity that he feared might prove incriminating, even if it were entirely unrelated to Mrs. Hartington's death. Whimsy observed Aldington's evident distress, with an expression suggesting neither sympathy nor condemnation, but rather the detached interest of a scientist observing the behavior of a laboratory specimen, and he continued his questioning with inexorable precision, focusing upon the specific chemical compounds with which Aldington had worked during his pharmaceutical employment, and whether he possessed any knowledge of substances capable of producing the apparent symptoms consistent with natural death, whilst actually resulting from the administration of toxins. At this point in the questioning, Aldington appeared to undergo a sudden transformation, and his defensive posture collapsed entirely into what appeared to be a mixture of relief and profound despair. He admitted, with evident anguish, that he had indeed possessed knowledge of certain chemical compounds that might produce the appearance of natural death, whilst actually resulting from deliberate poisoning, and that he had in fact conducted research into such compounds during his pharmaceutical employment and had maintained a continuing interest in the subject throughout the intervening years. However, he insisted with desperate vehemence that this knowledge had never been translated into action, that he had never harbored any intention of harming Mrs. Hartington, and that the discovery of the mist, bonnet, and the circumstances surrounding the old woman's death had filled him with horror and terror at the possibility that his knowledge and expertise might be suspected of having been employed in the commission of a crime. When Whimsy inquired whether anyone else possessed knowledge of Aldington's expertise in toxicology and his continuing interest in botanical compounds, Aldington hesitated considerably before admitting that he had, in recent weeks, received communications from an individual whom he had not seen in many years, a man named Arthur Dennison, with whom he had worked during his pharmaceutical employment, and with whom he had maintained intermittent contact throughout the intervening decades. Dennison had, apparently, recently resurfaced in Aldington's life and had begun asking detailed questions regarding Aldington's knowledge of particular compounds and his theoretical understanding of methodologies through which such compounds might be administered without detection. This revelation produced an immediate intensification in Whimsy's interest, and he inquired regarding the specific nature of Dennison's questions, the apparent motivation for Dennison's sudden reappearance in Aldington's life, and whether Aldington possessed any knowledge of Dennison's current activities or whereabouts. Aldington admitted that he possessed limited information regarding Dennison's recent history, though he understood that Dennison had experienced considerable financial difficulties and had become involved with individuals of questionable character, and that Dennison's recent communications had suggested a man in desperate circumstances who was seeking to exploit his former colleagues' expertise for purposes that Aldington could not fully comprehend, but which he feared might involve unlawful activity. When pressed regarding whether Aldington possessed any evidence of His correspondence, letters, telegrams, or other documentary materials. Aldington initially demurred, but subsequently agreed to produce a packet of correspondence that he had retained, apparently unable to bring himself to destroy evidence of his connection with Dennison despite the obvious risks that possession of such materials entailed. These documents, when examined by Wimsey and Parker, revealed a sustained campaign of persuasion through which Dennison had attempted to convince Aldington to provide detailed information regarding the properties of particular botanical compounds and the theoretical mechanisms through which they might be administered to an unsuspecting victim in such a manner as to produce the appearance of natural death. The correspondence suggested that Dennison was engaged in planning the murder of some individual, but had deliberately refrained from identifying the intended victim or revealing the ultimate purpose to which Aldington's expertise would be applied. Yet the timing of the correspondence was highly suggestive. The earliest letters dated from approximately 8 weeks prior, suggesting that Dennison's plan had been conceived and set in motion well before Mrs. Hartington's death. Wimsey consulted with Parker regarding the necessity of locating Arthur Dennison and bringing him into custody pending investigation of his potential involvement in Mrs. Hartington's murder, and Parker expressed his agreement that such action was urgently warranted. However, inquiry into Dennison's current whereabouts revealed that the man had apparently vanished from his previous residence some 3 weeks prior, leaving no forwarding address and having severed all apparent connection with his previous acquaintances and associates. Dennison had apparently been living in relatively modest circumstances in the vicinity of King's Cross, and his landlady reported that he had departed hastily one morning, leaving behind most of his personal possessions and indicating that he was departing London on business of an urgent nature. The investigation into Dennison's background revealed that he had indeed worked in pharmaceutical establishments during his youth, but had subsequently been dismissed from employment following allegations of theft involving pharmaceutical compounds and cash from the employer's office. He had subsequently attempted various commercial enterprises, most of which had failed, and he had accumulated substantial debts to individuals of questionable character, debts which remained unpaid at the time of his disappearance. This pattern of financial desperation and apparent involvement with criminal elements suggested to Wimsey that Dennison might have been engaged in the commission of a murder-for-hire scheme, in which he had been compensated by a third party to arrange the death of Mrs. Hartington in such a manner as to appear consistent with natural causes. Yet the question that remained unanswered was the identity of the individual who had engaged Dennison's services and the motivation that had prompted such a person to desire Mrs. Hartington's death. Wimsey proceeded to conduct a methodical examination of Mrs. Hartington's financial circumstances, her business dealings, and her personal relationships, seeking to identify individuals who might have harbored sufficient enmity or experienced sufficient financial motivation to warrant the engagement of an assassin. The investigation revealed that Mrs. Hartington had indeed been engaged in various business enterprises, including the management of rental properties and the oversight of certain commercial investments, and that her activities in these domains had brought her into contact with individuals of varying degrees of scrupulousness. More significantly, inquiry into her personal relationships revealed that she had been engaged in what appeared to be a decades-long dispute with her brother-in-law, a gentleman named Nathaniel Hartington, regarding the ownership of certain properties that had been inherited by Mrs. Hartington following the death of her husband, and that Nathaniel had apparently expected to receive himself. Nathaniel had apparently been involved in litigation regarding these properties for many years, with the courts consistently ruling in Mrs. Hartington's favor, and Nathaniel's financial circumstances had deteriorated progressively as his legal expenses mounted and his own business interests declined. Wimsey's investigation into Nathaniel Hartington revealed a man who had apparently reached the terminus of his financial resources and whose desperation seemed to have motivated him toward actions of considerable illegality and moral turpitude. Nathaniel had been observed in the company of various individuals of disreputable character during the weeks preceding Mrs. Hartington's death, and inquiry into his financial transactions revealed that he had obtained a substantial loan from a money-lender of particularly vicious reputation, a loan whose terms suggested that Nathaniel possessed some expectation of obtaining funds in the immediate future to satisfy the debt. The timing of this loan proved highly suggestive. It had been obtained precisely at the moment when Nathaniel would have become aware of the codicil to Mrs. Hartington's will that would result in the deprivation of his anticipated inheritance should his sister-in-law die under suspicious circumstances. This codicil appeared to have been inserted as a deliberate precaution against precisely the sort of financial motive that Nathaniel possessed, yet the very existence of the codicil suggested that Mrs. Hartington had harbored suspicions regarding Nathaniel's potential willingness to commit murder for financial gain. Accordingly, Wimsey proceeded to conduct a detailed inquiry into Nathaniel's movements during the evening and night hours preceding Mrs. Hartington's death, and he obtained testimony from various individuals suggesting that Nathaniel had indeed been absent from his residence during the critical period, and that his whereabouts during those hours remained unaccounted for. However, the most damning evidence emerged when Wimsey arranged for a detailed chemical analysis of the residue that had been discovered within the mysterious bonnet and upon Mrs. Hartington's bedside table. The analysis revealed the presence of a sophisticated preparation derived from a particular variety of nightshade plant, a preparation that had been specifically designed to produce the appearance of natural cardiac failure in an elderly woman with pre-existing cardiac conditions. The sophistication of the preparation suggested that it had been created by someone possessing considerable knowledge of botanical chemistry and pharmaceutical methodology, expertise that seemed entirely beyond the capacity of a desperate and impoverished man like Nathaniel Hartington. Moreover, the analysis revealed traces of a particular binding agent and preservative that was characteristically associated with pharmaceutical preparations created during the 1890s, suggesting that the compound had been prepared years previously and then maintained in storage pending the opportune moment for its deployment. This detail proved highly suggestive to Wimsey, as it suggested that the murder had been planned with extraordinary patience and foresight, and that someone had been awaiting the appropriate moment to employ this carefully prepared instrument of death for purposes of their own. It was at this point that Wimsey experienced what might be characterized as a moment of profound illumination, during which various seemingly disparate elements suddenly organized themselves into a coherent pattern of such elegant and terrible logic that he was compelled to revise his entire understanding of the crime and the circumstances that had motivated its commission. The mysterious bonnet, the chemical residue, the sophisticated preparation, the timing of Nathaniel's financial desperation, and the curious codicil to Mrs. Hartington's will all appeared to be component elements of a scheme far more complex and far more deliberate than he had initially conceived. He requested of Parker that they conduct a detailed investigation into the history of Arthur Dennison's pharmaceutical employment and into the specific individuals with whom Dennison had worked during his tenure in various establishments. The investigation revealed that Dennison had worked, at one point during his career, under the supervision of a senior chemist named Dr. Edmund Hartington, a man who bore the same surname as the deceased Mrs. Hartington, but whose relationship to her, if any existed at all, had never been clearly established. Further investigation into Dr. Edmund Hartington's background revealed that he had been a brother-in-law of Nathaniel Hartington's. That is to say, he had been the brother of Mrs. Hartington's deceased husband and Nathaniel's brother. Dr. Hartington had possessed considerable expertise in botanical chemistry and had been engaged in the development of sophisticated pharmaceutical preparations during the latter decades of the 19th century. He had, moreover, harbored considerable resentment toward Mrs. Hartington, whom he regarded as having unjustly prevented him from accessing financial resources that he believed ought to have been distributed to him and his brother Nathaniel following their brother's death. Dr. Hartington had apparently created the sophisticated botanical preparation years previously as a theoretical exercise in pharmaceutical chemistry, but he had apparently come to regard this preparation as possessing practical utility in the resolution of his financial grievances and his desire for revenge against a woman whom he regarded as having wronged him and his family. Most significantly, Dr. Edmund Hartington had disappeared from London approximately 5 years prior and was presumed to have died, though his body had never been discovered and no definitive evidence of his death had ever been established. The investigation into his presumed death revealed that he had departed London following a personal crisis of significant magnitude and had apparently taken refuge in some remote location where he had apparently maintained contact with Dennison through a network of intermediaries and coded correspondence. Wimsey theorized that Dr. Hartington had survived and had orchestrated the murder of Mrs. Hartington from his place of exile, utilizing Dennison as his instrument and Nathaniel as a secondary beneficiary whose financial desperation had made him susceptible to recruitment into the conspiracy. The mysterious bonnet appeared to have functioned as a delivery mechanism for the botanical preparation. The garment had presumably been soaked with a volatile solution containing the active compound, and when Mrs. Hartington had inhaled the vapors emanating from the damp fabric, she had absorbed sufficient quantities of the poison to produce the cardiac distress that had culminated in her death. The placement of the bonnet upon the dressing table suggested that it had been left as a deliberate message to those who discovered the body, a signature, as it were, identifying the hand of the perpetrator and conveying a meaning that had remained obscure to the initial investigators, but which now seemed transparently obvious to Wimsey's analytical sensibilities. The mystery of how the bonnet had been introduced into Mrs. Hartington's locked chamber occupied Wimsey's attention with particular intensity, as this detail seemed to constitute the crucial element upon which the entire edifice of the crime depended. If the perpetrator could be identified and apprehended through the mechanism by which they had gained access to the chamber, then the entire conspiracy would unravel with the inevitability of a carefully constructed house of cards subjected to even the slightest disturbance. Dorothy, the lady's maid, had testified to the presence of a mysterious figure departing from Mrs. Hartington's chamber at approximately midnight, and Wimsey proceeded to conduct a detailed inquiry regarding the precise description of this figure and whether Dorothy possessed any capacity whatsoever to identify the individual in question. Dorothy admitted that she had observed the figure only briefly and in conditions of minimal illumination, but she characterized the individual as being of medium height and slight build, with movements that suggested either genuine femininity or a deliberate simulation thereof through affected mannerisms and careful attention to bodily comportment. This description suggested to Wimsey that the mysterious visitor might not have been a man at all, but rather a woman who had perhaps employed masculine disguise or who had deliberately adopted masculine effects to facilitate her access to the household without arousing suspicion regarding her true identity. Upon reflection, Wimsey realized that the key to understanding the mechanism of the crime lay not in the identity of the perpetrator, but rather in the nature of the relationship that had existed between that perpetrator and the household members who had provided testimony regarding events of the critical evening. He requested that Parker conduct a detailed investigation into the personal and professional relationships of all household members, with particular emphasis upon identifying any connections that might exist between the servants and individuals connected with Dr. Edmund Hartington or Arthur Dennison. The investigation revealed, with considerable surprise to both Wims, and Parker, that the housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, possessed a daughter who had married a man named Thomas Dennison, a brother of the aforementioned Arthur Dennison, and that this daughter had maintained contact with her mother throughout her married life, though the specific nature and frequency of their communications had apparently not been documented in any official capacity. Furthermore, inquiry into Mrs. Pemberton's background revealed that she had once been employed by Dr. Edmund Hartington in a domestic capacity, and that she had been dismissed from his employment under circumstances that remained somewhat obscure, though she had apparently received a substantial sum of money as compensation for her departure and her agreement to maintain absolute silence regarding the circumstances of her termination. This revelation suggested to Wimsey that Mrs. Pemberton might have possessed considerably more knowledge regarding the circumstances of Mrs. Hartington's death than she had previously admitted, and that her apparent participation in a conspiracy of silence among the household staff might have been motivated not merely by professional loyalty, but rather by direct complicity in the crime itself. Accordingly, Whimsy requested that Parker arrange for Mrs. Pemberton to be brought in for detailed questioning, and when the housekeeper presented herself at Parker's office, she exhibited none of the defensive hostility that might have been anticipated, but rather seemed to have resigned herself to the inevitability of confession. She admitted, with evident relief at the opportunity to unburden herself of the weight of her secret knowledge, that she had indeed been employed by Dr. Edmund Hartington years previously, and that she had harbored considerable affection and loyalty toward him, despite the circumstances of her dismissal. She confessed that Dennison had approached her some months prior with a request for assistance in gaining access to Mrs. Hartington's household, and that she had, after considerable internal struggle, agreed to cooperate with the conspiracy because she believed herself bound by old loyalties, and because Dennison had led her to understand that no actual harm would befall Mrs. Hartington, that the entire scheme was designed merely to frighten her and to motivate her into redistributing her wealth in accordance with the desires and necessities of her surviving family members. Mrs. Pemberton admitted that she had been the individual who had gained access to Mrs. Hartington's chamber on the night in question, and that she had been the one responsible for placing the damp bonnet upon the dressing table whilst Mrs. Hartington slept, believing that she was merely executing a harmless prank, or at most a scheme designed to produce temporary cardiac distress that would frighten the old woman into reconsidering her financial arrangements. She had no knowledge, she insisted with evident anguish, that the bonnet had been treated with a lethal substance, or that her actions would result in Mrs. Hartington's death. When confronted with the medical evidence regarding the nature and concentration of the botanical preparation, Mrs. Pemberton collapsed entirely into a state of profound despair, recognizing that her participation in what she had believed to be a mere conspiracy had resulted in her becoming an accessory to murder, a realization that appeared to strike her with devastating force and which seemed to transform her entire understanding of her own moral and legal culpability. She provided, under this emotional duress, a detailed confession regarding the conspiracy's structure and participants, including the identification of an individual whom she had met only once, a man of perhaps 60 years who she had understood to be Dr. Edmund Hartington himself, though she possessed insufficient knowledge to confirm this identification with absolute certainty. Whimsy proceeded to utilize the information obtained from Mrs. Pemberton to orchestrate a comprehensive investigation into the locations where Dr. Hartington might have taken refuge following his departure from London 5 years previously. The investigation revealed that Hartington had apparently established a residence in the Scottish Highlands, in a remote location that would have afforded him complete isolation from the world and unlimited opportunity to pursue his botanical and pharmaceutical researches undisturbed. An expedition to this location, conducted under Parker's authority with Whimsy's participation, revealed that Dr. Hartington had indeed maintained a residence in the region, though the house had apparently been abandoned within the past several weeks, and all evidence suggested that Hartington had become aware that his conspiracy had been discovered and had fled once again into exile. The investigation into Hartington's financial circumstances revealed that substantial sums had been transferred to him through a network of intermediaries, and that these transfers had ceased abruptly at approximately the time when Nathaniel Hartington's financial difficulties had become acute, suggesting that Nathaniel had no longer possessed resources sufficient to maintain the financial arrangements upon which his brother's cooperation depended. The investigation into Nathaniel Hartington's involvement in the conspiracy revealed a man whose desperation had rendered him susceptible to manipulation, and whose moral principles had proven sufficiently malleable to accommodate his participation in a scheme that he had apparently believed would result in financial benefit without genuine risk of criminal liability. Nathaniel admitted, under questioning, that his brother Edmund had approached him approximately 8 months prior with a proposal that was presented as a theoretical exercise in pharmaceutical innovation, but which had gradually evolved into a concrete plan for the murder of Mrs. Hartington. Nathaniel had been offered substantial financial compensation for his cooperation, compensation that would satisfy his mounting debts and restore his financial circumstances to a condition of approximate respectability. He had been led to understand that the murder would be accomplished in such a manner as to appear entirely consistent with natural causes, that no suspicion would attach to him or to any member of the family, and that upon Mrs. Hartington's death the codicil to her will would prove ineffectual, and he would inherit his share of her substantial estate, thereby ensuring his complete financial rehabilitation. However, the critical element that had apparently escaped Nathaniel's comprehension throughout the entire duration of the conspiracy was the question of motivation that had driven his brother Edmund to conceive and execute such an elaborate scheme of revenge against a woman who had, from Edmund's perspective, been instrumental in his financial ruin and his social disgrace. Edmund, it emerged, harbored an obsessive hatred toward Mrs. Hartington that had apparently begun to manifest itself in the form of deliberate psychological torture and manipulation decades previously, and which had intensified to the point of complete psychological dominance following his forced departure from London. The investigation into Edmund's background revealed that he had been engaged in pharmaceutical research of considerable sophistication during the latter decades of the 19th century, and that he had apparently been on the verge of developing preparations of significant commercial and medicinal value when Perso. Gnarl and financial circumstances had intervened to derail his career. Mrs. Hartington, acting in her capacity as executor of her late husband's estate and as trustee of certain family investments, had apparently refused to provide Edmund with financial assistance necessary to complete his research, and she had instead redirected the funds toward other purposes that she had deemed more worthy of investment. This refusal, combined with Edmund's discovery that his brother Nathaniel had apparently been favored by Mrs. Hartington in certain financial matters, whilst Edmund himself had been deliberately excluded from comparable opportunities, had apparently crystallized Edmund's resentment into a consuming obsession with revenge. The sophisticated methodology employed in the murder, the carefully prepared botanical preparation, the ingenious delivery mechanism utilizing the damp bonnet, the deliberate timing that had exploited Mrs. Hartington's pre-existing cardiac conditions, all of these elements suggested a mind of considerable intellectual sophistication, but also a personality structure characterized by profound psychological disturbance and an apparently total absence of normal moral constraints. Edmund appeared to have invested his entire psychological and intellectual energy into the planning and execution of his revenge, and he had apparently regarded the death of Mrs. Hartington not merely as a means of financial gain, but as an end in itself, an expression of his will and his dominance over a woman whom he had come to regard as the embodiment of all injustice and personal failure in his life. The investigation revealed that Edmund had maintained detailed journals documenting his grievances and his plans for revenge, journals which expressed sentiments of such bitter enmity and such complete psychological alienation that they seemed to border upon genuine clinical insanity. Thank you, yet Edmund's ability to manipulate and coordinate the activities of multiple conspirators, Mrs. Pemberton, Denison, Nathaniel, and apparently others whose identities remained undetermined, suggested a degree of functional intelligence and interpersonal sophistication that seemed incompatible with the indicators of profound psychological disorder that his writings displayed. Wimsey reflected upon this paradox with considerable interest and expressed the opinion that Edmund Hartington represented a particular category of criminal personality characterized by the simultaneous possession of considerable intellectual sophistication and complete moral depravity, a personality structure that was, in Wimsey's experience, considerably more dangerous than the crude criminality of individuals motivated by simple greed or passion. Such individuals possessed the capacity to rationalize their actions through elaborate philosophical frameworks, to manipulate and exploit the vulnerabilities of others with extraordinary precision, and to persist in their criminal activities with the patience and methodical attention to detail that might otherwise characterize an individual engaged in legitimate scholarly pursuits. Edmund, in Wimsey's analysis, had apparently transformed his desire for revenge into a quasi-scientific project, regarding the murder of Mrs. Hartington as an intellectual and technical challenge worthy of his considerable skills and capacities. The fact that the victim was an actual human being possessed of her own inherent dignity and right to life appeared to have constituted no significant obstacle to Edmund's willingness to proceed with his plan. The investigation into Edmund's current whereabouts proved considerably more challenging than the investigation into the circumstances of the murder itself, as Edmund had apparently possessed sufficient foresight to arrange F, or multiple false identities, and to establish lines of credit and financial resources that would permit him to remain concealed from official authorities indefinitely. However, Whimsy's analysis of Edmund's psychological characteristics suggested that the man was unlikely to have genuinely adopted the lifestyle of anonymous concealment that his circumstances might seem to require. Rather, Whimsy theorized, Edmund would have sought out some environment in which he could continue to pursue his intellectual interests, and in which he could maintain contact with individuals who might provide him with the intellectual stimulation that his personality structure apparently required. Accordingly, Whimsy suggested to Parker that they conduct inquiries among the pharmaceutical establishments and botanical research institutes scattered throughout the British Isles and the continental universities, seeking to identify any individuals who possessed Edmund's particular areas of expertise and who had apparently established themselves in these locations within the past 5 years. This strategy proved unexpectedly productive, as inquiry into a small botanical research establishment located in the Swiss Alps revealed that an individual fitting Edmund's description had indeed established himself as a consultant and researcher some 4 years previously under the assumed name of Dr. Edward Hartwell. The individual in question had apparently been engaged in highly sophisticated research into the properties of various alpine botanical species, and he had apparently achieved sufficient standing within the scientific community to publish several papers of considerable technical merit under his assumed identity. However, he had apparently disappeared from his position approximately 3 weeks prior, at approximately the same time that the investigation into Mrs. Pemberton's involvement in Tech-E conspiracy had begun to gather momentum, suggesting that Edmund had maintained some network of informants capable of providing him with intelligence regarding the progress of the investigation. Whimsy's strategy for locating Edmund Hartington proved to hinge upon an understanding of the man's psychological disposition that suggested Edmund would not have abandoned his intellectual pursuits entirely, but would rather have sought some environment in which he could continue to indulge his obsessive engagement with botanical research, whilst remaining concealed from official authorities. Accordingly, Whimsy reasoned that Edmund might have established himself in some remote location, possessing the requisite botanical diversity and intellectual resources to support his continued research, and that he would likely have maintained contact with certain individuals in the scientific community who possessed sufficient intellectual sophistication to appreciate his work, and whose professional obligations would render them disinclined to report suspicions regarding his identity to the authorities. Whimsy's inquiry into the scientific establishments and botanical institutes of North Africa and the Mediterranean revealed that a gentleman fitting Edmund's description had apparently established himself as a naturalist and botanical researcher in a remote region of the Moroccan Atlas Mountains, where he had apparently been engaged in documenting and analyzing the properties of rare alpine species indigenous to the region. The individual in question had apparently maintained contact with several European botanical institutes and had published several monographs of considerable technical merit that had attracted favorable attention within academic circles, despite being published under the assumed name of Dr. Samuel Hartwell. The circumstances of Edmund's residence in Morocco suggested that he had selected a location sufficiently remote and sufficiently chaotic in terms of political and administrative organization that official authorities would encounter considerable difficulty in conducting investigations or effecting arrests. Moreover, the region possessed a tradition of harboring various European expatriates and adventurers who sought refuge from their previous lives, individuals for whom questions regarding identity and previous history were regarded as matters of supreme indiscretion and were therefore rarely broached. This environment appeared to constitute precisely the sort of locale in which Edmund might have expected to establish a quasi-permanent residence, whilst continuing to pursue his intellectual interests with minimal risk of discovery or apprehension. However, Wimsey observed that Edmund's apparent establishment of himself as a published scientist with legitimate credentials within the academic community suggested that the man had not abandoned his fundamental need for intellectual recognition and professional validation, and that this psychological requirement might ultimately constitute the vulnerability through which Edmund could be located and apprehended. Accordingly, Wimsey proposed to Parker that they arrange for the publication of an academic notice regarding a fictional international botanical conference to be held in Barcelona, with particular emphasis upon the presentation of research concerning rare alpine botanical species and their pharmaceutical properties, subjects that would almost certainly prove irresistible to Edmund's intellectual predilections and his obsessive interest in botanical chemistry. The stratagem proved remarkably effective, as inquiry among the participants in the fictional conference revealed that an individual identifying himself as Dr. Samuel Hartwell had indeed submitted an abstract and had indicat his intention to present a paper concerning the therapeutic and toxicological properties of a particular rare alpine species indigenous to the Moroccan highlands. The correspondence between the conference organizers and this individual revealed communication patterns and intellectual preoccupations entirely consistent with Wimsey's analysis of Edmund's psychological characteristics, and it confirmed his hypothesis that Edmund remained incapable of resisting the opportunity to present his research to an audience of educated peers, despite the considerable risk that such visibility might entail. Accordingly, arrangements were made for local authorities in Barcelona to maintain surveillance of the conference venue and to apprehend the individual identifying himself as Dr. Samuel Hartwell upon his arrival. Wimsey expressed his intention to be present at the moment of apprehension, expressing the opinion that his presence would prove psychologically advantageous in facilitating Edmund's eventual confession and in ensuring that the perpetrator's confession would be delivered with sufficient precision and detail to establish beyond reasonable doubt the complete structure of the conspiracy and Edmund's central role within it. The conference itself was scheduled to commence on a Tuesday morning in early spring, and Wimsey arrived in Barcelona the preceding afternoon, having conducted a final consultation with Parker and with the Spanish authorities regarding the logistics of Edmund's apprehension. The conference venue was a substantial academic building situated in the heart of Barcelona's intellectual district, and it was occupied by perhaps 200 individuals representing various European scientific and academic institutions. The abstract submitted by Dr. Samuel Hartwell had been assigned a presentation slot on the conference's opening day, scheduled for mid-morning, and Wimsey accordingly positioned himself within the lecture hall in such a manner as to obtain an optimal view of the presenter without himself being immediately visible to an individual entering the space from the conventional entrances. The audience assembled for the botanical presentations proved to be a mixture of genuine scientific practitioners and various individuals of more questionable motivation, including what appeared to be several individuals whose primary interest in the proceedings seemed to derive from their professional obligations as participants in the surveillance operation. The morning presentations proceeded with the ritualistic tedium characteristic of academic conferences, and it was only as the appointed time for Dr. Hartwell's presentation approached that Wimsey observed a figure entering through the rear of the lecture hall. A man of approximately 65 years, whose appearance had been considerably modified through the adoption of a false beard and the employment of various cosmetic and sartorial strategies designed to alter his apparent age and general appearance. Despite these modifications, Wimsey recognized the individual with complete certainty as Edmund Hartington, and he observed with considerable interest the manner in which Edmund conducted himself as he proceeded to the podium and prepared his presentation materials. Edmund's demeanor suggested a man of genuine confidence in his intellectual capacities and a complete absence of apparent anxiety regarding the possibility of detection or apprehension. His presentation itself was characterized by considerable technical sophistication and by an unmistakable passion for the subject matter that animated his discourse with a vitality that transcended the usual academic monotone. Indeed, Edmund's presentation was sufficiently compelling that Wimsey found himself momentarily distracted by genuine interest in the scientific material being presented, and he was compelled to remind himself that he was not attending the conference in his capacity as a natural philosopher, but rather in his capacity as an investigator engaged in the identification and apprehension of a murderer. It was only as Edmund neared the conclusion of his presentation that the Spanish authorities, acting upon Wimsey's signal, entered the lecture hall and proceeded to apprehend the speaker, an action which produced considerable confusion among the assembled audience and which generated the predictable hysteria attendant upon the sudden interruption of academic proceedings by uniformed police officers engaged in what appeared to be the arrest of a legitimate participant in the conference. Edmund Hartington's response to his apprehension was characterized initially by a curious composure that suggested a man who had anticipated this denouement with something approximating philosophical resignation, as though the entire conspiracy and its eventual exposure constituted merely the final chapter in a narrative whose conclusion had been predetermined by forces operating beyond the sphere of individual volition or resistance. He submitted to the restraint without protest, and proceeded to accompany the Spanish authorities to the location where Wimsey had arranged for a private interrogation to take place, an interrogation conducted in the presence of Parker, who had traveled to Barcelona for precisely this purpose, and in the presence of several Spanish officials whose legal authority over the matter was ultimately ambiguous, but whose participation seemed necessary to satisfy various governmental and procedural conventions. It was within this austere chamber that Wimsey conducted his final confrontation with Edmund Hartington, and it was here that the full architecture of the crime and the psychological motivations underlying its commission were finally articulated with precision and clarity. Edmund began his confession without prompting or coercion, addressing Wimsey with a tone suggesting not hostility but rather a kind of detached intellectual admiration, as though he regarded the detective as a fellow practitioner of the analytical arts, and therefore a person possessed of sufficient intellectual sophistication to appreciate the elegance and sophistication of the conspiracy that had been orchestrated. Edmund explained that his obsession with revenge against Mrs. Hartington had commenced not in recent years, but rather decades previously, when he had first become conscious that his sister-in-law regarded him with contempt and was actively engaged in preventing his access to financial resources that he believed rightfully belonged to him as a member of the family. He had watched with mounting resentment as Mrs. Hartington had accumulated wealth and influence whilst he had struggled with limited resources to pursue his scientific research and professional advancement. The refusal to provide him with financial assistance for his botanical research had apparently crystallized his resentment into something approaching genuine psychological obsession, and he had devoted years to constructing an elaborate fantasy in which he would ultimately achieve a comprehensive victory over the woman who had thwarted his ambitions and denied him the recognition that his intellectual capacities deserved. The development of the botanical preparation had begun as a purely theoretical exercise, Edmund explained, a demonstration of his mastery over the properties of natural substances and his capacity to manipulate organic chemistry in pursuit of objectives that others would regard as impossible or impractical. Yet as years had progressed and as Edmund's personal circumstances had continued to deteriorate, this theoretical exercise had gradually transformed into a concrete plan for murder, a plan that had possessed the additional advantage of providing Edmund with the opportunity to achieve financial gain whilst simultaneously satisfying his obsessive desire for revenge. Wimsey inquired regarding the mechanism through which Edmund had been able to maintain contact with Nathaniel and to manipulate the situation to ensure that Mrs. Pemberton's cooperation had been secured. Edmund responded by explaining that Nathaniel had proved to be a surprisingly susceptible subject for manipulation, as the man's financial desperation had rendered him capable of rationalizing virtually any scheme that promised even marginal improvement in his circumstances. Edmund had maintained contact with Nathaniel through a network of intermediaries, and through the employment of coded correspondence, that had proven effective in conveying his intentions whilst maintaining sufficient deniability to protect both parties from immediate legal liability. Regarding Mrs. Pemberton, Edmund explained that her previous employment in his household had provided him with considerable leverage, as she had harbored personal loyalties and emotional attachments that Edmund had been able to exploit through a combination of appeals to sentiment and carefully constructed lies regarding the benign nature of the contemplated action. Edmund had deliberately misrepresented the danger that Mrs. Hartington would face, suggesting that the scheme was designed merely to frighten her or to produce temporary discomfort rather than permanent death. By the time Mrs. Pemberton had realized the true nature of what had transpired, Edmund had explained, it would be too late for her to reverse her participation or to prevent the consequences of her involvement, when Whimsy inquired regarding Edmund's understanding of the codicil to Mrs. Hartington's will that would result in the deprivation of Nathaniel's inheritance, should the death appear suspicious. Edmund responded with an expression suggesting profound contempt for what he regarded as his sister-in-law's presumptuous attempt to anticipate and prevent his revenge. Edmund explained that he had regarded the codicil not as an obstacle, but rather as a demonstration of Mrs. Hartington's awareness of his intentions and her conviction that he possessed both the motivation and the capacity to achieve her death. The fact that she had taken steps to protect her estate from Nathaniel's potential inheritance had seemed to Edmund to constitute an acknowledgement of his superiority and his ability to outmaneuver whatever defenses she might construct against him. Moreover, Edmund had apparently anticipated that the appearance of natural death achieved through the botanical preparation would render the codicil entirely moot, as the authorities would be incapable of determining that any foul play had occurred and would therefore regard the death as consistent with natural causes, thereby permitting Nathaniel to inherit his share of the estate despite the theoretical provisions of the codicil. It was precisely this confidence in his ability to achieve a perfect murder that had apparently rendered Edmund vulnerable to the relatively unsophisticated stratagem through which Whimsy had ultimately located and apprehended him. Whimsy reflected upon this final interview with considerable philosophical detachment and expressed the opinion that Edmund Hartington represented a particular category of criminal personality that was perhaps more dangerous and more difficult to manage than individuals motivated by simpler passions or more transparent greed. Edmund possessed the intellectual sophistication to construct elaborate justifications for high actions and the psychological resilience to persist in his criminal activities despite the considerable risks involved and the absence of any genuine probability that his ultimate objectives would be achieved. He had apparently transformed his obsessive desire for revenge into a quasi-scientific project regarding the murder of Mrs. Hartington as an intellectual and technical challenge worthy of his considerable abilities, rather than as a moral transgression against a human being possessed of inherent dignity and the right to life. This transformation of personal hatred into intellectual exercise had apparently rendered Edmund capable of the sustained patience and meticulous attention to detail necessary to accomplish the conspiracy, across a span of many years, and through the manipulation of multiple co-conspirators. Edmund was subsequently remanded to custody pending his trial for murder, a trial that would ultimately result in his conviction and his execution by the French authorities, as it was ultimately determined that his apprehension in Barcelona and the recovery of documentary evidence from his residence in Morocco constituted sufficient basis for French jurisdiction over the matter. Parker expressed his gratitude to Whimsy for the investigative work that had resulted in the identification and apprehension of Mrs. Hartington's murderer, and he suggested that Whimsy's particular talents and analytical capacities had proved invaluable in circumstances where conventional police investigation would have likely concluded that the death resulted from natural causes. Whimsy responded to this expression of gratitude with his customary diffidence, and observed that the matter had presented sufficient intellectual interest to warrant his involvement, and that the ultimate success of the investigation seemed to depend less upon any particular brilliance on his part than upon Edmund's fundamental inability to resist the opportunity to present his research to an educated audience. a weakness that suggested that even the most intellectually sophisticated criminal possessed certain psychological vulnerabilities that an astute investigator might exploit. As Whimsy departed Barcelona and made his way back to London, he reflected with characteristic irony upon the manner in which human psychology, with its compelling need for recognition, its obsessive desire for revenge, and its capacity for the rationalization of the most profound moral transgressions, continued to provide endlessly fascinating material for investigation and analysis.